Welcome to Houston Sports Talk with your host, Robert Land.
Thanks for checking into the best Houston sports podcast, part of the Bleav Network. And joining me to preview the Texans-Bears game is our Bleav colleague, Chicago Bears insider Lukas Berry on the other side of the screen from me, host of the Bleav and Monsters podcast. Always fun to go behind enemy lines for the Texans previews, and great to catch up with you, Lukas. Thanks for doing this.
Absolutely, Robert. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to preview this week's game and talk to you a little bit about what happened last week in the Bears and Titans game.
Yeah, and your honor, I'm wearing one of my favorite T-shirts. It's a Bears hero of mine, Brian Piccolo. I got this made during the pandemic, so this is a Brian Piccolo football card, and on the other, you can't see it, but on my back is the backside of the Brian Piccolo football card, so you can see the front and the back if you got to see the whole shirt. But yeah, huge fan of Piccolo and Sayers, and like everybody else, just one of my all-time favorite movies of all time. Definitely was Brian's song.
Absolutely, it's such a good movie, and that is an awesome shirt. You said you had that custom made?
Yeah, had it custom made. Wanted to get a Brian Piccolo shirt. I was having difficulty finding something, I think, when I was looking around, and I was like, just go ahead and do it myself. So I got it done. Let's get into the last week's game. The Bears, they beat the Titans 24-17 in week one. What did you learn, Lukas, about the Bears in the opener? And save some of the Caleb takes, because I definitely want to get details on him in just a second. But just overall, what were your takes from that one?
I mean, if you followed the Bears closely for a number of years, this was the most Bears game ever. Just complete lack of offense, and the game was carried and won by defense and special teams. We've seen that so many times before throughout Bears history. I mean, since the Devin Hester days, defense and special teams has been the Bears calling card. And in this game, it came through once again. Obviously, the offense was very concerning. To be brutally honest with you, I mean, you're in the division with him, but, Will Levis just kind of gift wrapped that game to the Bears as well. I think the Titans will be a work in progress throughout this year. I knew this was probably a good matchup for the Bears coming into the year, because the Titans, just like the Bears, had a lot of turnover in the offseason with a new coach, second-year quarterback, and basically a brand new offensive line. And really that's kind of what determined the game in the second half. Was the Bears dominated in the trenches. The Titans didn't even get past midfield, and the Bears were able to muster up a special teams touchdown off a blocked punt, a defensive pick six. And then the only thing the offense did was score a 2-point conversion and not turn over the ball. Yeah,
you got a touchdown from a former Texan, Jonathan Owen, too, right?
Yeah, it was pretty cool to see. And I mean, it was super cool to see the guy that blocked the punt too, Daniel Hardy, was kind of a very cool undrafted free agent story. A lot of people were like, this guy's probably not going to make the roster, but he had a good preseason and he's a fun story. Lo and behold, he makes the roster, and then he makes a play like that, in the biggest of moments. So really cool stuff to see. And I'm not sure what you took away from like the Texans special teams in week one, but the Bears did some cool stuff out there on special teams. Like the punt block design they had drawn up was a very solid play. Honestly, it wasn't just guys rushing and getting lucky. Like they actually drew something up and it worked. And I saw a few kickoff returns too with another former Texan, DeAndre Carter. The Bears ran a little counter action on one of the kickoffs, and it's going to be interesting to see how teams develop to this new kickoff rule in the league.
Yeah, I don't know if Texans fans are sweating another blocked punt, because it was so unusual for them to give up one in week one. And that was sort of a little bit of a catastrophe. But I just, my takeaway in our post-game show was, hey, you got away with a win in a game that you gave up an easy touchdown there in a division game with the blocked punt. And, there's just a lot of confidence, I'll say, Lukas, with Frank Ross and the special teams, because it's been one of the best parts of the Texans. He was kept from the previous regime. It wasn't somebody that came in with D'Amico. That's how much they think of Frank Ross. So I would guess it's not going to happen again, but boy, it's something they're going to be focusing on that, I'm sure, in practice all this week.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, this year, the special teams is just that much more key with the new kickoff rules, encouraging more kickoffs and the whole nine. But it's obviously not a formula for the Bears to win a lot of games this year, with an offensive output like they put out last week. The offense is going to have to kind of pull its weight at some point or another. But I do think in the meantime, the defense is a solid unit. Are they going to be as good as we saw last week? I don't know. That's a question we can kind of get into if you want, but the defense is definitely good enough to at least help carry their weight a little bit while Caleb is still learning the ropes.
All right, you mentioned his name. Let's talk about him. How do you and Bears fans feel about Caleb after what you've seen so far?
Yeah, I'd be lying to you if I said the first game wasn't, a massive disappointment. Now we saw that touchdowns and passing yards and offense as a whole was down around the league. I think only one quarterback had over 300 yards passing, so kind of a down week overall. But still, Caleb going out there and only throwing for 90 yards and hovering around a 50% completion percentage is not what you want to see. I went back and watched the film. It's not like the situation was perfect. The Bears' offensive line is in really rough shape right now. And, they're going to have to figure that out in a hurry. But when Caleb did have time to throw, he had some open guys that he just overthrew. He looked nervous. I know he said he doesn't get nervous. I've kind of wish he didn't say that just because he puts a big target on your back when you go out and have a performance like that week one. But not setting off the panic alarms yet, but definitely disappointed in the week one output.
There are tons of alt universes with the Bears, Panthers, and Texans because of that trade last year. And I'm going to remind Texans fans that the Bears could have kept the number one pick, taken either Bryce or CJ Stroud. How do you feel, Lukas, or how did you feel, I should say, when the Bears made the deal initially? And what was the fan reaction at that time?
When they made that trade, I mean, that whole game was just crazy with the, the week 17 versus the Colts, or week 18, I guess it is. That game was insane. The Bears knew after they lost to the Vikings that week that a Texans win could, grant them that top pick. And then it was just like almost a miracle that everything happened the way it did in the fourth quarter. The ball going through multiple defenders' hands on the Colts, a play that probably should have been intercepted. And I mean, really, that was just a franchise altering moment for the Bears. At that point, I think they were pretty sold on having Fields come back. From my own personal perspective, I honestly wasn't super sold on Bryce Young coming out. Stroud was an interesting prospect to me, but it wasn't, I think now, obviously, in hindsight, he's phenomenal. But looking back on it, I don't think he was like a surefire slam dunk pick. So the Bears, the main takeaway in that trade was that the Bears got multiple pieces. They got DJ Moore, a true number one receiver that they were severely lacking. They got a starting right tackle in Darnell Wright, who is arguably their best lineman. He's still got some learning to do. And then they obviously got the first round pick the following year, which turned into Caleb Williams. The gift that keeps on giving, the Panthers owe the Bears a second round pick this year after this season. And after week one, it's looking like that might be pretty high in the second round. So it's hard not to think that this worked out very well for both our teams. And, the Panthers were the big loser in all this.
No question. I mean, it's crazy that, here you are. And it's like, well, it was a great trade, but man, the quarterback is this thing you got to get right. And it's not going to really know for a little bit, I guess, on Caleb Williams, but we already know about CJ Stroud, which is nuts after just one season. And one of the things I think is real interesting with you guys is with all the movement that you guys have done the last couple of years, you've had a coach and Matt Eberflus that like, okay, where is he at right now? What is that going like? Is he good, bad, average? Where are you landing on his coaching so far?
He's a tough guy to gauge. He really is. I mean, I can't say I was super big on the hire when it happened. When they brought him in, I mean, the Bears have been going through the cycle where they just switch from an offensive-minded coach to a defensive-minded coach. But especially this time, coming off Matt Nagy, I wasn't specifically like, oh, we got to get a defensive mind in here. Like, we knew that Fields needed developed, or they would bring in a new QB eventually. So the fact they went with him was interesting just because, I mean, it worked out for the Texans. We see D'Amico Ryans put a phenomenal staff together and is developing CJ Stroud. But traditionally, you want kind of that offensive mind to develop your young quarterback. Eberflus, I think, is a true player's coach. He kind of struggles at the podium sometimes, stumbling over his words, but I think his message kind of gets across. And it's really interesting because he's kind of an old school type guy. Like, it's kind of like a big throwback to the Lovie Smith days, honestly. Like his messages, he loves that Tampa 2 defense, his hits philosophy of, have all the guys running to the ball at all the time, takeaways, just preaching the basic football principles like a true football guy through and through. I like him as a person, as a coach. I'm still on the fence. I think he's had a couple rough seasons because the team was really bad, but this is the first year where I'm like, he has a solid team. Let's see what he can do in game and how he can manage these guys to either some victories or defeats and really see what he's made of. But with drafting Caleb Williams, I don't think he's on the hot seat. And I think he'll be here at least for another year or two after this, just because they're really trying to keep the continuity with this thing going.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting how that works out. And I want to get to the matchups in just a second, but just a quick reminder to our audience to share your thoughts in the YouTube comments on this game, whatever's going on with the Texans, and click the like button to support the show if you haven't done so already. Also subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast app. All right, Lukas, let's move to the Texans-Bears and the matchups. And is there an area or two on either side of the ball that you feel like the Bears can take advantage of against the Texans?
Man, it's going to be tough to say how they could take advantage of the Texans defense, just because I think it's hard to really take anything away from what the Bears did last week. And if anything, I think the Texans have the big advantage on defense of kind of just seeing how the Titans absolutely dominated the Bears in the center of their offensive line. I mean, Justin Simmons and T'Vondre Sweat had their way with the center and both guards. So the Bears' main weakness coming into this is obviously that and an inexperienced quarterback. I would say with the Texans, not that the interior players are bad, but they're definitely not Jeffrey Simmons and T'Vondre Sweat. I think their strength is probably more in the edges. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Will Anderson and Danielle Hunter are two pretty damn good DNs. But I will say I think the Bears' tackles are definitely better than their interior players. I mentioned Darnell Wright. They have Braxton Jones on the other side, who's a solid left tackle. He's nothing special, but I think that'll be an interesting matchup to watch overall. I guess the weakness in the Texans is probably up the middle. How do you feel about that? I mean, how the Texans looking with their linebackers and interior D linemen?
Yeah, the concern with the Texans was the linebacking core. I thought going into the first game, because without Christian Harris, and I didn't have a whole lot of confidence in the backups. I mean, Toa was all right, but you talk about the inside of the Texans defensive line. They were good, but really, I mean, one of the guys that they're missing right now is Danico Autry, former Tennessee Titan, actually, because, I think he would have been playing some either inside, or maybe they moved Danielle Hunter inside on some of the, some of the later downs in those series. And, with him out with the suspension, they don't have quite the depth inside or the playmakers inside that they can do something right there. But, the inside guys are solid, but they're not spectacular. You're right. It's the edge guys on the defensive line that make the big difference. And, I'm also kind of curious, like your secondary is fantastic. And that's going to be the ultimate matchup in the game. It feels like to me is your secondary against Nico and Tank and Diggs. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, see, I've been, I really, when the schedule came out, I was really looking forward to this because of those matchups. I do think the Bears secondary is kind of getting, more notoriety now than they have been. But kind of last year, I think they were just a very underrated group. I mean, Jalen Johnson, to me, I think he's one of the best corners in the league. Will Levis, he got beat one time. He did get beat by Calvin Ridley one time, but the Titans didn't take advantage. It was a poorly thrown ball. And then the second time they threw at him in the game, was an interception. So overall, his stat line, I think, was 1 or 2 targets. He gave up -2 yards and had a pick. So Jalen Johnson is fantastic. And then, second-year player Tyreek Stevenson has been very, very good on the other side. I mean, he has given up some big plays here or there, but he always also seems to make some big interceptions. He had a handful of them last year. He had the pick 6 in this game. And then obviously, one of the first picks, the Bears, when they hired Ryan Poles, the first pick he made was Kyler Gordon, who plays a lot in the slot. And when he's healthy, is also a very solid player, and he's great in the run game. The Bears secondary, they'll get up there. They like to hit. I do think the interesting matchup between all these receivers is probably Tank Dell, just because I think the Bears corners are bigger and they play a more physical style. But I don't know if they quite have the speed to keep up with a guy like Tank Dell, who's just so elusive, so quick off the snap. So really interested to see what he can do. And something I've seen over the years with this Bears defense is that they're really, really good against, subpar offenses. But sometimes when they play good quarterbacks, they're not quite as good as they might lead you to believe. So this will be their first big test this year, and I'm interested to see how they respond after the big week last week.
Is there a particular guy that's going to be covering, say, Nico or Tank, or do you see a particular matchup? Do you think it's going to be pretty mixed up, and it's just going to depend on, what they're going to do from down to down?
Yeah, I think it'll be pretty mixed up. The Bears traditionally, at least under Eberflus, haven't sent, Jalen Johnson as a spy per se on a team's number one receiver. And I also think in a case like the Texans, where they have basically 3 guys who could potentially be a number one on any team, you're going to kind of get the matchups you get and live with it. But I do think the Bears corners are good enough to slow them down. More interested to see if the pass rush is able to kind of throw CJ Stroud off his time a little bit. Something I was kind of fascinated with what the Colts did last week was that they really focused more so on the receivers and left kind of huge running lanes, only rushing 4 all the time. I'm interested to see. I think the key for the Bears on defense is going to be trying to dial up some pressure. But if they do what the Colts did last week and really drop that many men into coverage, it's going to be a long day because Joe Mixon's just going to gash them on the ground.
What are the injuries for the Bears that matter going into Sunday? And we're talking, I should say, Wednesday afternoon. So this stuff is very always changing. But what are the ones that you're paying attention to from the Bears side?
Keenan Allen has had a heel injury basically all of training camp, and I know there was a report that said he was overweight. I don't think he's really been overweight. I think he's just been dealing with this heel injury that he's had since last season, honestly. And I kept him at some games last year, and he pulled up limp on one route last week. I do think this is kind of more of a veteran precaution. I do expect him to play. Rome Odunze, he hasn't really proven anything yet, but one of the bigger names on the injury report that I think has a decent chance not to play this week. One of the last plays last week, he got rolled up and he had an MRI. Apparently he just has a grade 1 knee sprain, but I don't know how cautious they will be with him. So if he doesn't play, you'll probably see Tyler Scott elevated. He was inactive last week, but he's kind of like a speedy slot receiver. So you might see him active this week if Rome Odunze can't go. And then another one was DeMarcus Walker, who plays D-end/D tackle. You're probably familiar with him from his days in Tennessee. Solid player. He was held out today, but I think he will most likely play on Sunday night.
Yeah, the Texans, I just saw on the injury report was Dalton Schultz, which I don't know when that popped up, but it's sort of a big deal, although Brevin Jordan played really well in the first week, and Stover did a great job blocking the rookie tight end out of Ohio State. So, it's a sort of big deal, but, I don't think it's going to be a game changer with all the weapons that the Texans have and how good they looked in so many other areas in game one. What do you think the Bears formula is for winning this game? How can they win this thing?
I kind of alluded to it earlier in the show. I mean, I don't expect them to get a special teams touchdown, but they're going to have to turn the ball over. And this is something Matt Eberflus has kind of always preached. The Bears are one of the best teams in the league last year at taking the ball away. But I mean, it sounds cliche. They're going to have to take the ball away probably 2 or 3 times to win this. I don't think the offense is magically going to, snap its fingers and come out and put up 400 yards of offense. It's going to be gradual baby steps for these guys. And I think a defensive mind like D'Amico Ryans is going to do his best to put Caleb's mind in a blender. On offense, the Bears really have to try, again, cliche stuff, but last week I think they abandoned the run way too early. They had Caleb throwing too many passes, trying too many deep balls, and he was just unsettled all day because of that interior pressure. So I think the Bears need to establish that run with DeAndre Swift. They gave him a big bag of money in the offseason to kind of keep the Texans back a little bit, keep their rush back a little bit, and then go from there. I am interested to see the Bears potentially work the middle of the field more this week. They didn't do too much of that, but one of Caleb's strengths coming out was his quick release and just able to operate that fast, quick release, get the ball out quick on slants and that kind of stuff to kind of open up the deep stuff. But the Bears are going to have to play, very fundamentally sound. And I think the defense is very good, but I don't know if it's going to be good enough to keep Houston out of the end zone as much as they'd probably like to.
Yeah, that's a big thing. You mentioned, talking about Bears going deep and, what could happen there. That's the concern with the Texans defense is they were just torched on the deep passes from Anthony Richardson last week. They're going to have to get that stuff fixed. And I don't know if the secondary is good enough to fix it. That's one of the, I think, real question marks with this Texans team. It was a concern for me last year as well. They're favored by 6.5 going into the game. Is that about what you expected? Is that fair?
Yeah. In my own prediction, I'm feeling that the Texans will probably win by about a touchdown. I do think that's fair, but I would also not be surprised, to see the Bears put up a decent fight for 3 quarters and kind of fizzle out at the end. My thing is, I just don't think the offense at this point is going to be able to score enough points to kind of keep up with the Texans. And in an offensive league, you just, like I said, you can't win relying on defensive turnovers and touchdowns all the time. And like I said, I think the Bears defense will do a good job of slowing them down, but to really beat the Texans, you're going to have to kind of play in a shootout, and that's not going to be the Bears style of football this year. At least not yet. You say all this thing that I'm like, hey, where have I heard that before with Bears teams? Defense, special teams. It just seems like that's been rinse and repeat now for, my entire lifetime. It's a long time since the offense is like what the Bears. When was the last time the Bears had an offense that they were, excited about, that fans were excited about? It had to have been the Jay Cutler days. And then it was quite the opposite because the defense was one of the worst in the league. The head coach was, Mark Trestman was a wild coach. You never knew what you were going to get week to week. But when you had Brandon Marshall, Alshon Jeffrey, Matt Forte, and obviously Jay Cutler, who could spin the ball a little bit. It was a fun offense to watch. But then, it was, like I said, quite the opposite. The defense couldn't stop anyone. They were poorly coached, and it just didn't last long. I'm hoping this team can buck that trend. But until the Bears prove me otherwise, I'm going to have to, honestly admit that I don't think the offense is quite ready to compete with a team like the Texans yet.
Tell us a little bit about Bleav in Monsters, the podcast. And I assume Monsters comes from the Monsters of the Midway moniker, correct?
Yeah, Bleav in Monsters. I honestly think, I forget what Bears player used to say it. I think it might have been Akeem Hicks, but Bleav in Monsters was just kind of one of those things where the Bears defense those few years near 2018 was just so good. And it was just like, they were the monsters. They were the monsters of the Midway. It was just a force to be reckoned with. So kind of just took that and ran with it. It's a podcast me and a couple of my buddies do. We're all over the map. Actually, none of us are local to the Chicago area, believe it or not. I'm out here on the East Coast. I have someone down south in Alabama who covers the Crimson Tide. We have someone else out in Colorado. But Bears fans are spread far and wide, and we kind of bond over our love for the team, even though we're all from different areas of the United States.
How did you end up as a Bears follower or fan or whatever?
You kind of hit on it earlier when you were talking about, Brian Piccolo, just the all-time greats. At a young age, I was fascinated watching highlights of a lot of these guys, Walter Payton, Gale Sayers. I grew up with, the Brian Urlacher, Lance Briggs, Devin Hester teams. So they were just really fun to watch. Interesting choice for a 6 or 7-year-old to make. But it's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life because it's kind of been misery ever since I chose them. They had the one Super Bowl run, but I'm sure you can relate as a Texans fan. It's been a long time coming for our teams to be, really, really relevant in the NFL.
Yeah, we know it. 45 years since we even got to an AFC championship game. No Super Bowls in Houston in my lifetime. And it's a long lifetime for me. It goes back a ways to the Oilers and Love You Blue and all that stuff. And just really, excited about this game. I can't wait to see what these two teams come out and do, especially the quarterback play. And that should be fun. Definitely the first time we see CJ Stroud on Sunday Night Football, the first time we see Caleb on Sunday Night Football. So that matchup's going to be incredible. And if anybody wants to reach out, it's at @LBerry_40, right? That's your moniker?
Yes. Yep. That's my Twitter handle. You can follow me on there and tweet at me or whatever. Generally just talking about the Bears on there. So all in good fun.
All right. Can't wait for this one. Thanks again. We'll talk again soon, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Robert. I appreciate it.
You're listening to Houston Sports Talk.
Hey, don't forget to support us by subscribing and commenting on YouTube. You can always listen to us on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app. Tell your friends about us and share our show links on social media. Spread the word, everybody. Thanks for listening.